So we'll start our eyeball with a sphere. You could modify the attributes of the sphere to have the right number of edge loops you need if you've done this multiple times or you know ahead of time, or you can recreate it multiple times. I'm just going to stick with 2020. And so I'm going to call this one the eyeball. For how I'm constructing it, I'm going to duplicate this twice. So I'm going to duplicate it. One's going to be the cornea, and the other one's going to be iris. And I'm going to hide the iris object. Okay. So if you're to model this, we want to understand generally the scale of the eyeball, of course, and we want to know the proportion of the iris takes up compared to the eyeball itself. If you're going from real world, there's actual measurements you can look up and use, or if you actually have a specific character or even scan data, you can kind of align it up with that and just try to figure out those proportions of the eyeball to the iris. If you're doing a stylized character, that's based on your concept and is really hard to kind of I always think the eyeballs are actually kind of hard to size and scale because getting them to fit inside the eye socket while scaling them, you have to keep adjusting them. Anyways, so we're essentially going to try to figure out where our iris is, and we want to make this easier on us, we want to figure out where an edge loop would be. That would be kind of the border of the iris. So I'm just going to make an assumption and just say this is how big my iris is going to be. I might subdivide it and select another edge loop if, it was up here or down here, or slide the edge. Okay, so I don't need that for right now, like on this eyeball, but I'm going to take this cornea and I'm going to make the cornea essentially as big as the iris. So I'm going to pull this up. We're going to stitch this onto the eyeball at where that iris boundary is at. So if I come down here, right? So that's where I said the iris is. I want this cornea to be essentially as big as that iris. And I'm just going to stitch them together. So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the cornea. I'm going to detach everything below this edge loop here. And let's go ahead and isolate this object. So I'm just going to isolate it. Select the faces. So I'll go ahead and select these, delete them. And I'll unhide everything, unselect by clicking that. I'll come to this one. Let's go ahead and isolate it. And same thing. We're just going to create a hole there so they can combine together. And do that. So I'm going to come here, grab those two. I'm going to go to Mesh Combine. Actually, let's probably delete history, and then let's go ahead and combine them. All right, so if I got these really close together, I could just use merge. We can try that first. So let's go ahead and do merge. That looks pretty good. Whenever you do that and you are using a larger than small merge distance, you just do want to double check that you're not actually merging vertices where you don't want them to. And if I smooth that out, let's turn off that wireframe on shaded. That's what we get right here. And I might actually assign a blend material to this just so we can kind of see that reflection on it. So this bulge and that transition of the bulge, I recommend kind of playing around with this and trying to get a sense of what works for you and what feels accurate to your reference. So, what I might do is I might slide this, slide this up, back and forth a little bit just to kind of ease and soften that transition if I feel like it's too hard. But for the most part, I want to keep plugging along and not worry about it too much. Okay. So this is going to be our cornea sclera object. So I'll just call this one cornea underscore sclera. Okay. All right, so let's address this iris. So we'll go ahead and unhide it. And I'm going to go ahead and find out where that edge loop was. So let's go back out to here. So it was right around here. That's where our iris was. So I'm going to hide that. And we're going to go and select this. And we're going to detach this again. And I'm just going to delete this part. So I'm going to go ahead and move my pivot point to the bottom of this. So something right here. So it lines up with the bottom of that object. And I'm going to go and scale it down. So this is a little tricky because in reality, this object has a slight indentation, but it has kind of like some warp and wobble to it. So it's not perfectly bowl shaped, but it's very popular or common to create kind of like a bowl structure. So I'm going to use soft select and pull this down. So something like a little bit like this kind of indentation. And the reason why you do that is, well, one, because the iris, the way it catches light, kind of having this shape here makes it easier for the light to catch on the bottom of the iris. So that's going to help us a little bit with our caustic. And if you're going more realistic, you might have some undulation or variation to this shape. I'm just going to keep this kind of pretty shallow. And, it's up to you and how you want your, shader to react to make this like a little deeper, right? You can make it deeper as an effect. Okay. But I'm going to keep it, let's make it a little deeper. Okay. And so that is the iris. So we're going to cut out the pupil. So I'm going to go ahead and select this. I'm going to extrude it in first. So we'll go ahead and extrude it in. And then I'm going to go ahead and detach. So let's actually extract faces. So that's going to extract that pupil object. I'm going to push it back a little bit and then scale it up. So the pupil, let's do modify center pivot. Center pivot. And let's go ahead and scale that up. So the pupil's actually like, there's a lens here, but there's nothing. It's like essentially transparent. But we want to control the light coming through and hitting the back of the inside of the eyeball, right? So this is actually going to kind of act as a light blocker. And it's just going to have a really simple constant shader. So it's going to be black. It's not going to have any reflections to it. So it's going to feel like there's a void right here. Okay, so for on this iris, I might, add a few more edge loops to this, right? And so let's just add a few. And I probably would go ahead and select this edge loop and bevel it in a little bit. So we're just going to have an inside lip right there. So it bevels back that way. And I can select both of these and do a bit of a bevel. And maybe add an edge loop here. Okay, and so there is our iris. I'm going to also assign a blend material to it so we can kind of see the shape of that. And, it's a good idea to check this to find out, oh, do I like that shape that I have a little bit of an edge in here. I'm not going to worry about it too much, but if I was to be nitpicky, I would probably try to get rid of that if I was doing this more seriously. All right, so I'll go ahead and we're going to call this the iris. So we're going to go ahead and, so this is actually two objects. This one's going to be pupil, and this one's going to be iris. And we're going to delete their history. So we'll go ahead and delete history and pull those out. See if I can get that. Okay, never mind. So I'll go ahead and delete that object. Okay, so we have our cornea and sclera. We have our iris right underneath it, and we have our pupil. For the iris, it depends on how far out the cornea transition is. If it transitions to clear right here or right before the edge of the iris, then, I like the size of this. If I have it transition a little bit further back, I might want to extend the scale or the edge of this iris so we don't see just a black boundary. And another thing I've done before is I've also added like a faded transparency to the edge of this if it pokes through. So it's all dependent on how we set it up. And of course, for these, we probably will want to subdivide them or apply, in this case, I'm in RenderMan, you might want to apply a subdivision scheme or apply smooth modifier. For this one, you're noticing hopefully that there's a bit of a artifact here. And so that's caused by that really dense pull happening right there. Two things that can get rid of this is one, just adding more topology. So if I just went to mesh smooth, right, it's going to have more topology that tends to reduce the artifacting, but in this case, it didn't. And then the other thing you do is what I did on this other eyeball up here is I actually welded on. So let's go ahead and do this, and I'm going to turn on default material, actually welded on a grid. So that got that pole out of here. We do have some non-four-sided poles at the edges, but they're having a way less of an impact. You can see this is also pretty dense. But then this one had almost zero reflection issues or reflection artifacts. So that's just another approach you could take with it. So we'll come back down to here. And yeah, so this is the main components we need for the model itself. Okay, so let's UV unwrap our assets. I like to UV unwrap them in a very particular way because I like to use nodes like the ramp node inside of the Hypershade editor to kind of get some effects really quickly without actually having to leave the program and go into a texturing program. So I'm going to start with the iris. So I'm going to come here, open up my UV editor, and let's pull this. Oh, that's not what I wanted to do. There we go. And we'll just go and pull that right there. So I'll select this iris, and I'm going to actually just do a planar projection. So I want to open up the settings for that one, and I want to project it from the y-axis. We'll click apply. And to be completely honest, there's not much else I'd have to do with this one besides relax or unfold this inside part. So I'm going to go ahead and unfold these inner vertices or edge loops here. So let's go ahead and grab those ones. I'll make sure I get them all the way around on the inside too down here. So I might select these ones. Oh, and I got a lot more. So these ones I do want to relax out so I don't have overlapping UVs here. So I'll go to UVs, And let's go ahead and unfold those. There we go. And I could check for UV distortion. I'm not really getting very much, so I think that's pretty good. So I could go ahead and fold the whole iris, but I tend to then get a little bit of wobbliness or asymmetry to it, which in all honesty isn't that big of a deal. But in this case, I know that that planar projection is going to do a really good job. Let's turn that off because it's hard to look at. And I might want to just scale this down a little bit so that texture padding is, not going to bleed over the edges. And so that's pretty much all we have to do for the iris. But I do like this because since it's centered in the middle of my first UV shell, and because it's more or less symmetrical and taking up the same amount of space, across up and down, left and right, what I can do is I can use things like a circular ramp to essentially mask out or add color or do whatever I want to different parts of this iris. So that's the basic setup I have for this one right here. For the pupil, we don't really have to UV unwrap it, but I could just do the same thing, probably just do a planar projection and scale it down. It's not going to have a texture map, but if for any reason you needed texture maps for something to work, might as well just make the UVs the way you want it to. It's just going to be a black constant material though, so honestly I don't need to worry about it. Let's take a look at the cornea sclera. So this one is a little bit more, I wouldn't say tricky, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and do a planar projection again from above. In this case, because my object is oriented upwards, I'm using a Y planar projection. If you were modeling this forward or left and right, you would want to do a Z or X planar projection. For this one, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and cut it here. So I'm going to detach the components. And personally, I like to use a ramp to transition from the cornea to the sclera. So like the iris, I'm going to want to get this front part right here really well lined up with the center. Actually, let's go ahead and instead of cutting it right there, I'm going to go ahead and cut it here. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is, for this one though, because we have, if I just do planar projection, we have UVs overlapping right here, and UVs are essentially have very, very, very little space, right? So we're getting a lot of texture distortion right there. I'm going to actually want to unfold this one. So first thing first, I'm just going to grab this UV shell and get it out of the way. So I'm just going to move it to the side. This is going to be the back of the eye, so I'm not going to really worry too much about it. This one right here, I'm going to go ahead and unfold it. So let's go ahead and click Unfold. So I'm going to select that one, click Unfold, and we're going to take a look at this. And I'm getting a little bit of a text or UV unwrapping issue, so I think that's just a bug with the UV unwrapper. Let me go ahead and solve this really quickly. There we go. I just had to load in the Unfold 3D plugin. Sometimes it's turned off for some reason. Okay, so I want to go ahead and lay this out in that first quadrant. So I'm going to take up as much space as I can. I like to try to orient this if possible. So I'm going to select one of these vertical edge loops right here, and we're going to orient to edge, right? And that's just going to turn it. And you can see this actually did a really good job of actually making it symmetrical, even though I unfolded it. I'm sure there's some areas that are a little asymmetrical, but that's really not a non-issue here. And since I'm not going to really see the back of this, I'm actually going to go ahead and scale this down a bit and pull this and pack it in somewhere up here. Okay. So we will get a texture boundary here. So if you do plan to turn the eyes really far to the side, we might want to do it a little different. But for the most part, this is just unfolded nicely. So all those polygons here have a nice amount of texture space. There is some distortion because, as you can see, these are getting pretty big and these are getting pretty small, even though there's not that big of a difference between them. But for our purposes, this is going to be fine enough. If you were to do texture painting, so if you were to use Substance Painter or Mari, then you might want to unfold it so that you get less texture distortion. I'm unwrapping this in such a way that I can use the ramp feature inside of Maya, and I also don't plan to have a lot of texture detail on this asset at all. But if you were to texture it, you might want to change that up and actually cut it differently. Probably cut off the top, cut along here, and just lay it out like a flat cylinder, just so you get less texture distortion, which would mean you'd have to paint your mask a different way or create your mask a different way than using the ramp feature.